Why don't we just send up 150 nuclear warheads and blast that rock apart?
Terrible idea. Was I talking to you?
This is Dr. Ronald Quincy from Research, pretty much the smartest man on the planet. You might want to listen to him.
General, if you consider your target, composition, dimensions, sheer velocity, you could fire every nuke you've got at her and she'll just smile at you and keep on coming.
All right, Paul, we meet again.
J-Reg, it's good to talk to you.
I'm the true J-Reg.
That's fair, and I am the true. I am really the only centrist, really, that has ever existed. Although J-Reg's whole thing is anti-centrism. And in some ways, he called me, which I agree with, I'm a moderate anti-centrist. He's full-on anti-centrist, and I'm a moderate anti-centrist.
Yeah, well, I kind of accused him of being operating as a centrist because can you really entertain the extremes without sort of, operating in an almost kind of neutral center space? But enough about J-Reg. Maybe just to people who don't know who you are, who are you? What do you do? How can they find you?
Yeah, my name is Paul. I go by PF Jung on YouTube. And I am I've got two projects on YouTube. One is what I call applied sociology, which is identifying the mechanics of the Great Meme War, which is the war of ideas in Western civilization, right? Where people talk about a culture war. When people talk about culture war, that often they mean just like nonsense things, but I'm talking about a war for our culture. Like there's some serious ideological differences that will determine the fate of society. And so that's the Great Meme War, because it's technically a war between memes, right, in the Richard Dawkins sense.
Yeah.
So one of my key pillars is putting together a lot of diagrams and PowerPoints and illustrations on the mechanics of how memes spread, what makes memes powerful, what gives memes their psychological potency. And I don't just mean like images memes. I mean ideas, ideologies, narratives, all that.
Just but also, mimetic, that operate mimetically.
Yes, any sort of mimetic content. So that's one pillar. The other pillar is to actually help one side of the meme war win, which is the good guys. And I call the good guys the Dark Centrists, which is Dark Centrism is a meme. It's not a political campaign. It's not a political movement. It is merely a meme and label that I use to gesture. Is it your meme? Like, did you mint? Yeah. You minted. Yeah, Dark Centrism is my meme. Originally, it was Enlightened Centrism. Right. So the term Enlightened Centrism has existed for some time, mainly as an insult to, these people are both sidesing. It's like, well, actually, I think there's many situations where both sidesing is entirely appropriate, and it's the lack of both sidesing that creates, demented, degenerate ideologies. Like, for example, in Israel and Palestine, I think there's a fair amount of both sidesing that could be done to lay blame at either party. I think that's the reasonable and honest and true perspective, among many others. But basically, my point was, I thought my mission is going to be to reclaim the power of enlightened centrism. Right now, it's being used as a slur, and I'm going to take it back. So I said I was doing what black people did with the N-word, but on a much lower stakes.
Right.
So it was enlightened centrism for a while, and then I sort of
and you're a centrist, so you could say things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not a moderate centrist, because I wouldn't say things like that if I was a moderate centrist.
Right.
And then radical centrism was just another variation of it. And then more recently, in the last few months, I switched to dark centrism, which is really just, how like non-binary or like all the Zoomers nowadays, like they call themselves like demisexual and sapios, and they're just coming up with new labels all the time. Yeah. I'm just doing that, except for centrism, it seems. But the current manifestation of dark centrism is just, it's like dark matter. It's the opposite, and yet it's still matter. So I'm not a moderate centrist. My point is I reject what the kids call the neoliberal status quo. I think we live in a society that is the fundamental assumptions and philosophical kind of ideas that underpin our society lead to massive amounts of wealth inequality, alienation, hyperconsumerism, hedonism, all kinds of terrible things that afflict humanity. And I think that's what the moderate center has led to. Because people correctly recognize that liberalism has produced many good outcomes. So they think that, in the Francis Fukuyama sense, it's the end of history. Well, we just need to protect liberalism and freedom, and constant technological progress is only good and will ultimately be good in the end, even if it causes all kinds of problems. It's like, there's all these assumptions that I reject. However, I'm not far left and I'm not far right. And I think any far left movement, if it's really far left, or any far right movement, if it's really far right, causes destruction, virtually by definition of it being far left or far right. So the whole dark centrism idea is, I agree with the left and sometimes the far left on some things, and I agree with the right and sometimes the far right on some things. But I recognize that both, if you just pursue them as ends in and of themselves, are too ideologically rigid and cause the collapse of society. And so dark centrism is a funny, interesting way to provoke that idea in people. And to be honest, I think 80% of actually 90%, actually 100% of psychologically healthy people are dark centrists, in my opinion, ultimately, if you sat them down. Maybe they wouldn't admit to the label, but they would agree with all the precepts as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, I think it's a great pitch. And I appreciate you. So just to kind of backtrack a little bit, I really do like your idea of the great meme war, because that to me is I like the way that you frame that, because there is something about what's going on in politics that is real, but yet not real as things were, not as material. It's more like immaterial, ideological, psychological tug of war of ideas going on right now, which I think is different than maybe the very material struggle of ideas that happened in the previous century. Like it doesn't get more material than World War II. And a lot of us like to kind of use Hitler references and Nazi references all the time. It's hard not to. But I think, a big distinction between the key figures in the world today and the world back then is like you're saying, it's a battle of ideas kind of happening a layer above the real world. And obviously it has real world implications, but it's, J-Reg calls it metapolitics. That's sort of how he describes what he's doing. And I think it's nice to kind of start to get some language to describe what's happening. And yeah, culture war, I think it's not really enough. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And then I'm really curious, what has happened to you recently? Why did you feel the distinction to kind of put enlightened centrism behind you and embrace dark centrism, or essentially rebrand?
Yeah, well, I took a few marketing classes in college, but I've never been good at marketing. And branding is very difficult. And on the one hand, it was, like I said, it was a fun exercise to try and do that. Let me try and make enlightened centrism cool again. Let me take a negative term and make it cool. That was like a fun, and I had the audacity to think that I could do that. Then as time went on, I realized I'm wasting my time. Like I think I have interesting and important things to say on certain issues some of the time. And I'm finding I'm wasting my time just defending the label of centrist. It's like, I'm me. And like, I use the term centrist to kind of just immediately, or dark centrist or whatever, front load and set up a frame. But that's just a very blunt tool that, I do initially. Really, I think, the nuances, really I'm a PF Jungian. Ultimately, I will abandon dark centrism, I'm sure, and just bring about PF Jungianism, which is, if you think about it, all of our like major philosophical concepts are named after people generally, like Platonism or Aristotelianism. So it's kind of like, well, why do we do that? It's like, well, because to try and use some abstract term to capture an idea doesn't do it justice. You just have to look. It's like this person came up with it, and it's complex and nuanced. So we're just going to call it that. That person's name.
I do it with aesthetics, like Lynchian, Kubrickian.
Yeah, right, exactly. Now you could call. I don't know enough about film, but like, if there's a particular style of film that's doesn't have any music or something, you could call it like amusicalism or something like that. It's like, yeah, but that's not the only part of it. There's more nuance and stuff. Anyway, my what I've learned is, yeah, really, it's just kind of, it's so easy because, oh, well, you're not a centrist. A centrist would believe this. If I use the term centrism, it's like, well, people, it's evoking in other people their framework, which is the opposite of what I'm trying to do. It's like, I'm trying to tell you and frame things in a way that I see it. If I use a word that you already attach a definition to, it kind of defeats the purpose. So I learned that in the process. So the dark centrism thing it's kind of the best of both worlds, where it's just like, what is centrism? But dark centrism is like, is that the opposite of it? So it's like, it kind of establishes a frame.
Yeah. Well, there's a connotation with centrism as cowardice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Hassan, what was that quote recently? He basically was like, oh yeah, if you tell me you're a centrist, like I basically know that you want to put immigrants in concentration camps. Like that was sort of his summary of what moderate or centrist connotated to him.
Yeah. And, like there's terms like dark MAGA or dark woke, which I don't even know what they mean, but they sounded cool. And I was like, let's do dark centrism.
Yeah.
But really the impetus for that was just constantly was getting into just so many things about like, hey, because in my mind, exactly to that point, like why is centrism associated with cowardice? Because the idea is, well, we're always going to take the middle ground. So if I live in a society and the Christian theocrats have taken over and they want to execute gay people, well, the centrists would say, well, let's not execute them. Let's just put them in prison for 20 years. That's the reasonable compromise versus the LGBT revolutionaries or whatever. What I view a dark centrist is no. There is a balance that, between right and left that is an optimal balance. But if your society has veered all the way to the right or veered all the way to the left, the dark centrist allies with the opposite, throws his weight on the other side of the scale. So if we live in a Christian theocracy that we're executing gay people, it's not like, oh, well, let's get the middle ground of, just let's put them in prison or whatever. It's like, no, this entire theocracy needs to be called into question and dismantled to bring society back to the, Aristotelian balance or whatever. And the same is true on the left. If it was a bunch of like, when kids are born, we're injecting them with puberty blockers until otherwise. It's like, okay, now we're going to join the Christian theocrat revolutionaries to try and dismantle this system because it's so out of whack. So it's there is an optimal balance, but it's not whatever's between the two powers that be at any time.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I do think the majority of issues, it's undeniable there's some extreme circumstances happening right now. I think like the way immigration is being enforced, there's no doubt that that's an extreme outcome. So
and the way that like the DHS is tweeting about it with like memes and like mocking it, it's like, this is demented.
And that is kind of an interesting example where I feel like memes are overtaking reality and we're seeing material consequences, and it's almost like a wires crossed scenario. But I think with the majority of issues that the U.S. has long been divided on, abortion, LGBTQ, just kind of general sexual open-mindedness, the economy, I really think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit centrist positions on those issues that a majority of Americans would support. And so, yeah, I've found it actually quite flabbergasting that for the last 10 years, there hasn't been a mainstream political figure who's capitalized on that. And it does feel like almost kind of the meme identities of the two sides pull, the great example is Kamala Harris, saying, yes, we should pay for, the sex
transgender prisoners or whatever.
Yeah. Where it's just
sex
like
change operation.
the most absurd thing you could possibly get caught saying on camera. Is just sort of railed against you. And a lot of people, I think, will say that is being blown out of proportion. That is not one of the motivating factors. But I don't know. I would tend to disagree. I think that had a pretty big impact on the way an everyday American sort of perceived her.
Well, it's funny. I've spent many the first, I don't know, 2 or 3 years of my channel, I focused a lot on the transgender issue because for me, it was like, this is so obviously the front line of the culture war, the front line of the meme war, because everyone comes into contact with the notion of male and female and gender and all that. And it's like, to me, there was a very clear line. Adults can do what they want and should be allowed to pursue whatever body modification they want. Children should not. It's a simple line. And we have that line for so many other things. We keep it here. To me, that was so reasonable. Obviously, because,
Because you're the good
I only
guy.
pick the opinion that I think is reasonable.
No, but
if I didn't think it was reasonable, I wouldn't have that opinion.
I would totally back you up. I think if anybody wanted to be cautious but also open-minded, it would be a position roughly along the lines you're saying.
Yeah. But it's funny because I was so close to the issue all the time. I know like the terms like transmedicalism versus true trans. I don't know what it is exactly. But like, so when I saw that ad, Kamala's for they, them, Trump's for you, I was like, this is the lamest thing I've ever, this will convince no one because it's just like, what a one-dimensional surface, shallow level entry in the topic. I believe, I don't know how they measure effectiveness of ads, but to the degree that they can measure the effectiveness of ads, it was reported that was one of the more effective ads. And it's like, geez, okay. So,
Well, as someone who's made a lot of YouTube titles and thumbnails, I heard that one and I was immediately like, that is, if there was an art, if we were to qualify campaign strategy and language construction as an art form, that would be of the highest degree.
higher, we do it. Yeah. It's called propaganda. That's the term,
It as far as propaganda goes, it's is it S tier? Is that what we say?
S tier. Yes, it's the highest
Because it just
tier.
there's something, it hijacks your reptilian mind or your limbic system in a way that is so immediately visceral and comprehensible. And so it's been interesting to see. Well, and just to kind of double click on this issue, I mean, I've found it very strange. Like Pete Buttigieg just recently came forward and started to have a difference of opinion around sports. I found it so interesting that Democrats felt like they couldn't speak openly about sports because we've been living in a world where athletes have been subjecting themselves to very invasive biological marker tests as a means to be allowed to participate, whether that's weight, drugs, not having drugs in your system, testosterone levels. So being somewhat critical of what the parameters would need to be for somebody to be categorized for the sex of, the sport that they're playing in, considering how much the smallest edge can be the difference. I thought it was weird because, it was sports at the highest level at a certain point. Like the smallest difference means a ton. And so, you could decouple that from the larger social issue and it could just be a sports issue where it's just like, what is truly fair and protects the integrity of the competition without denying the humanity of people who exist outside of the traditional binary of sex and gender. It was very strange to me how that strata couldn't be established by a confident Democrat.
Yeah, well, one of the memes that I push, and it is a meme, is that anti-intellectualism is based, which is obviously a reaction to the people who hyper-intellectualize everything. And an example of this is Neil deGrasse Tyson. Neil deGrasse Tyson went on Bill Maher and was like saying we should get rid of male and female sports. Neil deGrasse Tyson is not a stupid person. And you look throughout history, it's like the smartest people can be convinced of the worst ideas. I think it was 15%. I mean, I'm not comparing these two issues. I'm making the point that smart people can be convinced by bad ideas. 15% of SS officers were PhD graduates, right? So it's like intelligence and reason does not lead to the same conclusions. There are tribal and cultural things associated with it.
What's interesting about him is, he's a science guy, but he's also a pop star. And so, I think he kind of showed his colors in that instance where like he was more loyal to, I think, public opinion and how it sort of flowed through popular culture, which I think he was more in tune with than necessarily like rigorous defense of scientific principles. I think, unfortunately, I think he showed his loyalty there. And to be fair, I had my own experience with this. Like, the pressure was real. This was back in 2020. Jubilee was, it was height of the pandemic. This was the summer, so it was like June. And so like protests are happening in downtown LA. Like, I can almost smell the smoke in my apartment. And I'm editing a video for Jubilee, which was one secret girl, and like 5 versus 5 guys. And they were all in a chat room with their cameras off, and the girl was pretending to be a guy, and they were trying to figure out which one was the girl. Classic stuff.
Yeah. The one odd man out or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Great.
Had a great time making that video. At the beginning of the video, I kind of did a little intro, like what makes a man besides, and then I kind of like threw the eggplant emoji on the screen, and the video got railed about that,
God.
which was obviously good for engagement. I had zero idea that this was going to happen. And people were just like, how offensive, like trans men are men. Genitalia does not determine if you're a man, which of course I was opening. The whole point was to open up the question, like, what makes a man besides the most primitive way of thinking about it, which would be your anatomy. And I immediately apologized and was like, trans men are men, or whatever you had to say. I said the magic words and kind of apologized in a personal comment. And you could probably go find that pinned comment today, but it's just an example of like, it didn't even feel like the onslaught of rage was so potently felt that in that moment, like, it almost was a matter of survival to respond with some sort of apology. But in hindsight, I just kind of was like, I didn't need to say anything. Like, the no harm, no foul kind of mindset. And so I can attest to, the political public pressure. And then someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson being somebody constantly under that pressure, it makes sense that it starts to actually mold your ideology, because you're so in touch with what the public finds offensive and inoffensive at any given moment.
Yeah, well, this is, it gets into the whole notion that the reason people were coming after you and the reason that ideology has its sway is because it's a religion. It's people's religious belief. It seemed, from how you've talked about it, it seems that you've drawn this distinction between memes and the material. Mm-hmm. There's the memes up here and there's the material. I don't draw that distinction. I think that, memes have material consequences, right? What ideas you have, changes your physical behavior, which has physical material consequences. And I view it as it's theological and it's religious. It's like someone's personal identity is wrapped up in this. And because our material conditions are satisfied, which, side note, we're reading Ted Kaczynski's manifesto for my book club. So I was listening to it today in the gym.
Careful.
I was benching and I was just like, this is the most, I don't know, put me on a watch list thing I've ever done. It's like I'm at the gym listening to the psychology of modern leftism and the power process and all these things. And anyway, there's a reason that people, like Ted Kaczynski is. He made so far 90% good points so far, some bad ones, but
you're the true red pill performative male if you're bench pressing with Ted.
Yeah, exactly.
Manifesto.
Yes, right. I noticed it like as I was sitting down. I was like, this is kind of funny. But one of the things he talks about is the power process, which is basically just like, look, if human beings have a will to power in the Nietzschean sense, but not necessarily power over others, but power over your own circumstances. And modern society denies that, which no one would disagree. Like, if it's like when it is so much more meaningful, like I suspect this is a common experience. When someone actually takes the time to cook like a whole meal for themselves and eat it, it's more rewarding generally than if they don't do any work and they just order DoorDash and it comes, right? It's like the act of putting in effort makes the actual food more rewarding, even if it's the same food in terms of quality and taste or whatnot. And the same is true, like you can, if you watch 3 hours of TV and then order DoorDash, you're going to feel very different eating that DoorDash than if you worked hard, like studying for a test for 3 hours and then got that as a reward. It's like, so as our material conditions became easier and easier and more provided for, and now you can go into debt to pay for DoorDash, so you can always get your microplastic infused burrito at any time. People feel, they feel a sense of disconnect and loss of agency. And Dostoevsky talks about this, in Men Are Not Piano Keys That You Can Play, all that type of stuff. So this is a common insight. And like the whole gender thing is like, well, I'm fighting for the oppressed. This is my religious mission. And like environmentalists are this, like, I'm going to glue my hand to a painting because the world is ending.
Right.
And so that's the meme. And it's actually, the meme war is important because it's like, are we going to let the environmentalist fundamentalists, because I'm an environmentalist, I'm a conservationist, I believe in, clean air and all that. Are we going to let the extremists now, make it more difficult for people to be able to power their houses or afford food because of their incorrect meme that, parasitizes their mind? And I think the same thing with the gender ideology stuff. Yeah.
Well, I guess one way I would kind of think of it is like, so Fukuyama might have been right to a certain extent, where like in the 90s, there was sort of enough of like a consensus culture, and material conditions were so satisfactory for enough people that it opened up this frontier, which conveniently sort of birthed the internet, which was sort of this frontier for a meme war, where like all of a sudden there was much more space, meta space, to hash out ideological tug of wars. And so we're sort of in this like soup, this hurricane of ideological struggles. And it's interesting that religion is coming up now, when it felt like religion was sort of, growing out. But religion is a powerful idea. It's a mimetic idea, perfect for the internet. And so, and this kind of brings us to Nick Fuentes. And, J-Reg sort of said, we're going to see this generation of politicians truly forged by the internet on their way in. And I think a lot of people might point to Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump as sort of politicians forged by the internet, but I would much more argue they were forged by television, and maybe some with a little bit of internet sprinkled in there. But like, I think Nick Fuentes truly represents this newer generation of like, he was raised and formed his way of thinking primarily through the lens of seeing and interacting with the world through his computer. And there's a generation of politicians that he's a part of that we have yet to see kind of come to being. And so something that I want to ask you is, you've kind of spent a little bit of time steel manning Nick Fuentes, not necessarily defending him, although at times sort of advocating for potential good he could do, because he doesn't not everything he says is necessarily hateful.
Not everything he says is as degenerate as the worst things he does say.
And so why is it important to you to engage with the possibility of someone like Nick Fuentes doing good, since we're sort of facing this world where, he's coming down the pipeline? And I think there's a kind of a battle right now. Some people are like, ignore this guy. Let's, he's trash. But people like you are kind of maybe taking him a little bit more seriously and seeing if you can kind of thread the needle.
Yeah. There's basically two ways to deal with someone like Nick Fuentes, how I see it. And Nick Fuentes is not just him himself. It's the ideology that he represents. It's like a meteor heading towards the Earth. Okay? There's two ways to deal with a meteor. You can nuke it and vaporize
Which we
it.
may have to do, according
Which
to
we may have-
Cleo Abram educated me on this like a day ago. But
With like meteors?
no, there's one, it's like we're like a decade out or something. But anyway, sorry.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, there you go. Well, so look, there's two potential ways to deal with a meteor. If the meteor is, let's call it, anti-Semitism or horrible far-right ideology, okay, which historically we know does all kinds of terrible things. So the meteor is coming. You either nuke it or you nudge it off course. Now, both of those in theory are viable strategies. So when someone like, all the people who just say Nick Fuentes is a hateful anti-Semitic scumbag, he's trash, he's a liar, they're just trying to nuke it. They're like, we're just going to shut it down. We're just going to socially stigmatize it. And that's a valid strategy for certain things. So like for certain, a different meteor, like the desire on the part of people to normalize certain relationships between adults and children. There have been mimetic movements like that in the past. NAMBLA, I think it was, right? Or not NAMBLA. The man-boy love thing or whatever. I don't know. Much
I don't know.
There's all kinds of weird stuff.
yes. Oh, okay.
And the French petitions, or the petitions that like Michel Foucault signed and all that.
right.
That's a meteor that I think you should nuke and just be like, actually, no, we're just not discussing this. Like, if you want to even bring up the topic of like, well, if a 12-year-old and a 30-year-old, nope,
Right.
we're done. You're nuked immediately. That's the appropriate strategy. So it is a case by case, how do you address certain things? This meteor, this tidal wave, this mimetic, object, you can't nuke it. You can only nudge it, because there's
Towards a
enough
different
core.
course.
Yeah, because there's enough reality to its core. Like, well, why is there so much criticism of Israel? Well, some of it's anti-Semitism. Yes, it's always been that
For
case.
sure.
Okay. What percent of the criticism of Israel is driven by anti-Semitism or 100% valid reasons?
Yeah.
I don't know. I would say, who knows? 80%.
It could be 50-50.
Yeah, could be 90-10.
90-10. Yeah.
And so but it's at minimum, it's 50-50, let's say, which is, I would say, vastly underestimated, but whatever. There's enough reality to the F Israel idea that you can't just nuke it. You now have to guide it towards something that is less destructive than where it could go. And everyone who calls Nick Fuentes hateful, degenerate, I call Nick Fuentes degenerate and say he's wrong about various things. But people who use the old, maybe not the pre-internet, but like 2016 and 2020, he's a racist. He's an anti-Semite. He's a misogynist. He's toxically masculine. If people just went out and said, Nick Fuentes is the most toxic masculine man. It's like you are reaching no one who needs to be reached. Because I was just at Thanksgiving and I talked to some of my 16-year-old, 19-year-old cousins. Like, you guys knew Nick Fuentes? It's like, yeah, he's hilarious. These guys don't know they don't know who Karl Marx is. They have no political literacy in any significant way. And yet they're like, he says some true things. I'm making my cousins seem dumber than they are. But my point is, he has charisma. He's riding a real, valid tide and wave. And so that meteor is coming towards us. You're not going to be able to nuke it. You have to guide it off path. And I think a better way of like, well, how do we guide the meteor off the path? Well, maybe we as a society, we as the commentariat class, create the incentives for people like Nick to disabuse themselves of all of the most horrible shit that they say and that they've done. I just made a video where he talks for like 2 or 3 minutes straight saying, Nick Fuentes, saying, why don't nationalist Republicans and populist progressives work together? And we can get healthcare and we'll do a compromise. The left has to give up open borders and the right has to give up the abuse and the racism. And he's like, there's marginalized people. What else would you call them? Like, there's people on the margins of society. So it's like, what I see is Nick Fuentes correctly recognizing that degenerate pro-Hitler, like talking about women in the most disgusting ways, is not a winning message. It's not a message that's going to appeal to people. It's not a message that would afford anyone any power if we're looking at it cynically. So he's recognizing, well, maybe I should step away from all this extreme stuff if I want the actual stuff done. The stuff that I agree with Nick Fuentes on, like decoupling the U.S. and Israel relationship, right? I am much more repulsed by someone like Randy Fine, who's a U.S. congressman, than I am Nick Fuentes. I'm much more repulsed by Benjamin Netanyahu than I am by Nick Fuentes. So if Nick Fuentes can push for a political movement that decouples the U.S. and Israel in a material way, then I think that's a reasonable political strategy. Now, am I 100% certain? No, maybe we should nuke it. Maybe you call someone hateful. It's like the gambling thing. You call someone hateful 1,000,000 times, it doesn't do anything. But when on that 1,000,000th and first time, calling them hateful actually does change someone's mind enough. Because you repeat something often enough, people believe it.
Yeah, I think you can only nuke when you have the convenience of a consensus culture. And so,
yeah,
when everybody is close enough to each other in their sort of bundle of opinions to where an outlier like that can be sort of shamed and humiliated because you just have the favor of the majority, it's a luxury. But I think it's a luxury that just doesn't exist in as malleable, politically malleable and volatile times as we exist now. And what's actually interesting is, so like to kind of use your banner, so you have Dark Centrism, which is like a dot right in the middle. Or no.
That's modern
enlightened or
on
moderate
the political
centrism.
Compass, the quadrants, yeah. Moderate
Which is
centrism is all the dots in the
lame.
middle. Yeah.
And then you have Dark Centrism, which is this sort of
all the
circle.
dots. Yes.
That is actually interesting to me, and it really sort of evokes some of what JREG is doing, which I actually find to be one of the more provocative and honestly motivating and optimistic ideas that I've engaged with or that I've sort of been pondering recently, which is that the path to a luxurious, enjoyable consensus culture is a myriad of alliances between people who are all existing in pretty radical ideological spaces for common, shared goals, which is, could be low hanging fruit like healthcare or, simple gun control legislation or whatever that be. And it's like, it's almost kind of an admission of like everybody, as a result of this sort of meme war that we've all been steeping in, exists in a pretty extreme ideological place. And so there truly isn't anybody in the center. The path forward is sort of these bridges between the extreme places or positions that we all hold and a certain level of kind of extreme tolerance. Does that feel like an accurate summary of why the distinction in those diagrams?
Yeah. And my advice or my insight would be the places where everyone agrees the moderate status quo has failed is the places where you can find alliances. It's hard. Well, aside from Taylor Lorenz, almost everyone agrees, let's ban cell phones from schools. Bo Burnham is someone who's very interesting to me because his arc is like he's in that bridge between he grew up on the internet. I mean, he was like forefront on Vine and all that. That's how he got popular. And he's like, you listen to his art now and his interviews, he's saying like phones will give you psychosis, get off of them. It should be illegal to be on the internet until you're 18 freely. And so it's like interesting.
Well, and he also just seems like somebody who's obviously very progressive.
Yeah, exactly. But he's putting forward very conservative points. This is my point of like, you can have someone who's progressively temperamental, but they know like, hey, I was on the internet. This isn't some boomer lecturing you about like, get off your phone and go outside. It's like, no, I was on my phone. I have psychosis now. I'm telling you, this is bad. And one of the consequences of the rate of technological progress increasing is that the gap between generations, a smaller temporal gap can contain a much bigger like quality of life gap. So the difference between like a 60-year-old and a 20-year-old is very significant. But now the difference between a 30-year-old and a 20-year-old is very different because there's an entire different ecosystem. Like I didn't have an iPhone until like late high school and then college. I didn't have Uber until midway through college. So like, these are relatively recent things that cause like big generational divides. And I think people who are younger are willing to listen to someone who's 30 more so than they are listening to someone who's 60. So there are Zoomers who will listen to Bo Burnham about like the internet and whatnot. And so where the liberal status quo has failed, that everyone recognizes has failed, are the areas of consensus. And then just things like nuclear power, like energy independence. We don't want to rely on the Middle East and Russia. We also don't want to put huge amounts of toxins into the atmosphere. And maintained and constructed nuclear power plants are very good at not putting out toxins in the atmosphere.
Yeah. Some sort of like red flag law around guns. Like they're
Maybe.
Okay. So
like bump stocks and getting rid of like automatic assault rifles.
Right.
Like it's like,
but whatever that could be, because again, the whole idea is invite everybody to the party and just see how many shared light switches can be found in the dark. And that sort of, I think, is what's going to be the political discourse process of the next decade.
Yes.
And so what's interesting is, like, I think you might have said this on X, you were kind of excited about the idea because platforming has come up. And there's sort of this idea of like, oh, don't platform someone like Nick Fuentes, don't offer your platform. But I think I would strongly disagree with that. I think it's not the sort of chant should don't platform. It shouldn't be don't platform. It should be platform responsibly. And so, Coleman Hughes, I think, wants to maybe debate Nick Fuentes, and he's been sort of responding to him. I think Nick Fuentes is smart enough and talented enough to have a conversation with someone like Coleman Hughes and to make himself appear to be much more reasonable and level-headed as a way to sort of like hold standing in that exchange than to sort of stand his ground and go full Nazi. And that could be a process of sort of this nudging process that you're sort of describing.
True, but also Coleman Hughes is smart enough to know that that's exactly what Nick Fuentes' strategy is.
Right.
So, if I were Coleman Hughes and I was going to interview Nick Fuentes, I'd go, okay, this is what I would do if I was going to interview Nick Fuentes, is like, Nick, why are the top comments in the last 4 year videos the most anti-Christian stuff I've ever seen in my life, talking about Jewish people? Jays are, insert all manner of horrible things. How is this? Do you reject that? And so do you agree that within the Groyper movement there needs to be you can even use his pro-Hitler stuff. Like there needs to be a Night of the Long Knives. The Night of the Long Knives was in like 1935 or something like that. Basically, Hitler purged the Nazi party of like all these different officers. So it's like, well, Nick, if you're Hitler, you need a Night of the Long Knives because you got a lot of freaks in your audience right now who are talking about Jews this way. That is explicitly at odds with your Christian, you say you're Christian message. That's one thing. But I just think Coleman Hughes I agree Tucker didn't push back as much as I'd liked him to have. Same with Dave Smith. I'd like someone to drill Nick Fuentes on the Holocaust denial stuff.
Yeah.
And what exactly do you believe? Tell me why. What about this? Da, da, da. It's like,
but I think this age of contrarian sort of like Tucker Carlson was the perfect guy for the job in the era of media that he occupied. When you're throwing red meat to an audience that has been narrowed down to like a perfect crystalline slice of the public that you can just rev like a gas pedal, And so he knew how to do that. And again, like artfully, whether that's propaganda, whatever we want to call it. And so in this new age that we're, kind of seeing over the hill of Trump, when it's just like this, anybody's ball game, I don't think people like Tucker are necessarily going to have the advantage. It's going to be people who can really entertain an interesting intersection of audiences. with kind of level-headedness, great preparation, great questions, and sort of holding people accountable to what people think their positions are or what they say their values are. And I think that's only going to happen if we sort of let this platforming thing go. And it's just like, okay, we don't want to see, one guy at a mic shoot the shit with this crazy, obscure historian who thinks that we got the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust all wrong. We want to see a thoughtful person guide a debate with that crazy historian and a far left historian.
Yeah.
Or an interesting panel featuring those folks, because it's only in the juxtaposition of how those people seem next to level-headed people that kind of that consensus can form, where people can go, oh, that guy's just a provocateur. That guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah. I mean, just from a strict market incentive and media incentive perspective, the videos that get the most views are when you bring two people of like entirely different worlds and different echo chambers together. Like, I don't know. Joe Rogan, I genuinely believe he's not motivated by money, because if the episodes where Joe Rogan brings on two different people, like Douglas Murray and Dave Smith, I thought that was phenomenal. Mm-hmm. Excellent for everyone involved, like in terms of just being able to you can hear both sides now talking. Dave Smith and Coleman Hughes debated.
Although, what's with Douglas Murray? I mean, that guy just like turned down the snarling.
I mean, when I think of like Destiny plus Jordan Peterson, Nick Fuentes and Sargon Avocad and Hassan Piker and Destiny all debated like 5 or 6 years ago, or more probably now. That was a big debate. So like, anytime you have these different worlds clash, it gets a ton of, because you're polling from both audiences, right? Because all day, if you listen to Hassan Piker, Nick Fuentes is an idiot. You listen to Nick Fuentes, Hassan Piker is an idiot. So both audiences go into it like, oh, this is going to be great because I'm going to get to see my guy destroy the other guy in front of his whole audience. So then, and everyone's coming with that same mentality. And so just from in the same way that like, oh, well, we opened Pandora's box and look what social media did and all that. Like, well, I think if you follow the incentives, you will see increasingly people who can bring two different sides together in an interesting dialogue. Not like just a screaming, if it's just people talking over each other, no one cares. But if it's actually like, you said this, let's pick this apart. Now you said this, blah, blah, blah. That's just so much more compelling to people. There's a certain subset of people that just like to be told over and over again that the bad guys are bad guys. And real quick, that liberal wine mom podcast?
Yeah.
The two ladies.
I can't remember her name, but yeah.
It's called like, yeah.
She's blowing up.
Yeah. Yeah. And she's very, very left wing. It's interesting. Just you listen to someone for 10 minutes and they tell you kind of what you need to know. And she grew up in the Bible Belt and firsthand witnessed incredible amounts of hypocrisy. People who say they're super religious and then they just don't care at all. That's obviously true. That's obviously a real phenomenon. And it was so interesting because I was like, wait a minute. You don't hate Christians. You don't hate MAGA. You don't hate... She'll say, of course she said she'll hate MAGA. But like what the truth is, you hate hypocrites. Your entire experience is characterized by people who around you showed this religious veneer and then were complete assholes. All the right-wingers also hate all those people, except they see it with the people who posted the black square and the BLM and never actually cared about black people. So you both hate the same people. They're just manifesting differently. And it's just like, oh, it's like...
Yeah. Well, and I think everybody hates bigots, but full stop bigots. And then everybody has bigot tendencies, whether they're willing to admit it or not.
Yeah.
Something that was actually so interesting. I saw an X, I don't know if you saw this. This guy, so Michelle Gondry directed a video and it had, I'm forgetting her name, but a famous white actress and A$AP Rocky in it, and they were like sort of a romantic pairing in the commercial. It's very frivolous, lighthearted, cheesy holiday commercial. And one of the top comments on it was, I think it was a black guy who was like, I don't know, I don't like seeing Rihanna's husband with a white chick. Like I'd rather see black on black love or white on white love. And it was sort of, everybody was railing on this, like, wait, what? Like, you have a problem with fictitious interracial relationships in a commercial now? But it was sort of a great example. And I'm sure the guy didn't mean it maliciously and probably isn't even a bigoted person, but it was a great example of when, like, the obvious conclusion of where identity politics or over correcting through sort of race policing leads you, which is to a point where you're criticizing a commercial because it depicts an interracial relationship, which is basically like you find yourself in the bigoted seat.
Interracial marriage that's sort of the ultimate litmus test of like, look, I have no problem if someone says, look, I'm black and I want to marry a black person and have black kids that look like me. Mm-hmm. And if someone's white and they say, look, I'm white, I want to marry a white person and have kids that look like me, I say that's perfectly fine. Anyone who calls you a bigot for having that preference is deluded. What I will not stand is when white people, mainly white pagans, will say you need to marry a white person and you're actually a race traitor for marrying another race. Okay, because now you're telling me that what I'm doing is immoral if I'm in a relationship with a Hispanic black woman or whatever.
Well, and then those are the people who are like going after JD Vance.
Yeah. And that's partly what Nick Fuentes does. And so it's like, and it's fine. I mean, look, I talk to actual Nazis, right? Like Nick Fuentes, I wouldn't call a Nazi. I think Nick Fuentes uses the Nazi imagery as a fuck you to the establishment. I talked to a professor who studies the far right. His name's Benjamin Teitelbaum. He's Jewish. And he himself is like, he went and met people who were covered in swastika tattoos, like in Scandinavia, like the ground zero of like a lot of this crazy stuff. And he's like, a lot of these people they're not actually like Nazis ideologically. What they're doing is just completely saying F you to the current reigning morality because they've been ostracized and this is their way to lash out. And I think Nick Fuentes is more like when he says, there's a debate clip of Dean Withers asking him like, who would you rather have be president, your wife or Hitler? And Nick Fuentes is like, Hitler. And it's like, okay, well, is that like a committed Carl Schmittian Nazi ideological statement, or is that a guy, trying to be edgy and all that? And I think it's more the latter. Partly what characterizes that,
you go
to continue this point, is because I have talked to actual Nazis. And one in particular, I was very hesitant to have a conversation with. Initially, I reached out to him and we were going to have a debate. We did have a debate and I just never posted it. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to listen to this person's perspective and, hear, because they have valuable information in terms of like, well, who do you think is a Fed? Nobody, like, I don't care what some guy thinks if Tucker Carlson or Nick Fuentes is a Fed. I want to know what the actual Nazi who he thinks is a Fed. Anyway, I talked to him, on a somewhat regular basis, and he's shared with me his personal story and background. And it confirms for me the thing I've known all along and believed, in part due to my personal experiences with people who fell down that rabbit hole. It's like, from my perspective, the entire motivation for this is 100% reaction to childhood trauma that is like one for one mirror to like, oh, this happened and now you hate black people. Oh, this happened and now you are like, I'll never betray my white race or whatever. It's like 1-to-1.
Well, and to go back to the meme and the material, it's like your meme persona is rooted in your biology, your physical body.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so it's partly why, and I suppose you could say it's, on the one hand, it either biases me or it makes me more informed than others. Is like I actually have a sense of what the real, actual Nazi far right people think, which is why I'm like, Nick Fuentes is clearly not doing that. And if you saw Nick Fuentes debate one of these people, they think Christianity is a tool of Jewish people, and Nick Fuentes is a Christian, so they will be fighting on that. And so Nick Fuentes is not as far right as those people.
It's the same way, the right or the sort of mainstream political right now is having to confront Nick Fuentes. If Nick Fuentes were ever to become the leader or one of the key figures on the right, he would have to confront that part of sort of his coalition. But something, it's funny, we really are just a bunch of memes like bumping around into each other, and like the goal should be to like find a thread to kind of that leads to the material person. And when you were talking about, have you seen the show, this is a great documentary I'd recommend called White Right Meeting the Enemy?
Is that Nadia Khan or Sadia Khan, or wait, what is her name?
Yes, Dia Khan.
Dia Khan. Yes, I have seen that.
Fantastic.
Is the very ending scene is like kind of heartfelt, and then it's comical for a minute, like in like a kind of a twisted way, because he's like, I won't ruin it for people, but I know exactly what you're talking about. That's a great documentary.
But you see, and she's an attractive, charismatic, warm sounding presence, and she interviews these men who have swastika tattoos and are full on showing up to Charlottesville like in Nazi attire, like the blood and soil guys, and she'll just start shooting the shit with them for 15 seconds, and you see their persona just melt away like butter, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, attention from a person who maybe my entire life has been inaccessible is suddenly being given to me generously, and you just see the person emerge from the meme. And I think Nick Fuentes is a great example of somebody who's just obviously sort of a figurehead for a generation that's kind of irony poisoned, where it's like, if you eat a steady diet of South Park and, and then the world falls apart and you're stuck in your basement, you might emerge saying some of the things that Nick Fuentes says. But that doesn't, I think people should just take a lot of that with a grain of salt and kind of put it in an ecological context. Because you're not going to get a chance to, I don't think the option to not engage is any longer on the table. So you got to find that thread to pull to get to the human. And like you said, it's probably the nudge tactic might be the only way to steer someone like him with a lot of influence towards a healthier, more consensus position, and maybe to even disavow a lot of the bullshit he said. So far,
he's already on that track, and like, let's assume that he's in the political arena for the next 20 years. Like, which direction is he going to go? Now, Coleman Hughes, he made a video about Nick Fuentes that was decent, but I think missed some fundamental things. But he did make the point of like, Nick Fuentes basically wants to moderate so that he can get into power and then implement these terrible things, and that's certainly a possibility. And I could see that being his motivation. But again, it's like, well, we live in a democracy. We have political coalitions. If it involves decoupling Israel or decoupling the U.S.-Israel relationship, good. And then if Nick Fuentes wants to like roll back women's voting rights, it's like, well, we're going to disagree on that, So it's like,
but Nick Fuentes won't thrive in a moderate environment, and so if all of a sudden he's moderating himself to then go toe-to-toe with a J.D. Vance type, which he's a generation behind, so it'd be somebody like of that, vein. Or I think Nick Fuentes' power comes from that contrarian, entertaining shtick. And so if he has to moderate himself to save face, you sort of, in a sense, diffuse his charisma over time. Because it's like, sure, I'll engage with you. I'll keep meeting with you, debating with you on this show or that show. And over time, you just sort of chisel at his persona, where it's just like, okay, this guy's not nearly as entertaining when he has to backtrack everything as he is when he's alone at a mic, just doing it all.
It's an endless cycle where someone starts out on the edge and they're like, I'm the loudest, most extremist. I'm the most misogynist, F women, F blacks, F all this different stuff. And then they see like, oh, I'm actually getting some attention. well, hold on, I can act. There's now black people that like me. Well, maybe I won't do the black people so much. And then eventually it's like, guys, we need to cut that down. And it's like, you changed, man. You turned on, and then a new one crops up. And then it's an endless cycle. And I've seen that, I've seen that before, and we will see it again.
Yeah.
And,
okay. Well, we can put a pin in it for now.
That's fair.
I appreciate you, breaking down the dark centrist game plan, and I guess consider myself a fellow dark centrist. And send me a t-shirt.
Look, the darkness is coming. The darkness is coming. Yeah, I go back and forth. I'm like, do I want other people to identify as it?
I'll let
It's
it be your thing, and then if it takes off,
that's fine.
Maybe consider letting me join.
That's fair. All right, that's fair. Well, yeah, the Dark Centrist Council will have to be formed once we secure enough mimetic territory.
We don't have a backup plan. This is it.
And this is the best that you can, that the government, the U.S. government can come up with? I mean, you're NASA for crying out loud. You put a man on the moon. You're geniuses. You're the guys that think his shit up. I'm sure you got a team of men sitting around somewhere right now just thinking shit up and somebody backing them up. You telling me you don't have a backup plan? That these 8 Boy Scouts right here, that is the world's hope? That's what you're telling me?
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.